you never take that pan and offer it to somebody and say, well, have a piece of cake. Why? Because it's batter, it may have eggs that are uncooked, it may have whatever's in there. Now, it might taste good, but the point is that's not what we would call a cake. You put it in the oven, 350. Is that the temperature? What would you guess? 425. Okay. Jessica says 425. She knows 100 times more about it than I do. So 425. We put it in. The average cake takes how long? 30 minutes? Depends on what kind. Could be 20 minutes, but at least 30. But usually in the 30 range. So in 10 minutes, if you pull it out, is it ready to serve? No, and most of us wouldn't call it a cake. We would say it's a mess. Why? Because it didn't stay in the heat long enough. The heat working in this particular cake is what produces the finished result. So if you let that stay in 30 minutes and pull it out, you're going to find something that's not just edible, but wonderful. Why? Because it stayed in the heat long enough with the right ingredients that you get a wonderful cake. Now, if you pull it out early, that won't work, right? Because it's not finished. What does James say? James says, my brothers, count it joy when you go through various pressures. Because as you undergo those pressures, it says, verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, but let endurance have its finished work. Then it says, then that you may be perfect or mature and complete, lacking nothing. So whatever we're thinking about circumstantially, we have to know that God is in it and that God has an intended result. God is wanting something to happen. Right? So we're not even necessarily wanting to offer this person an escape chute. Right? We're not trying to necessarily rescue them out of the circumstance. We want them to respond godly in it. Right? We want them to respond godly in the midst of it because God is up to something good. Now, just two warnings here, or two cautions, I should say, before we go to the next question. The first caution is shared experience. And the second one, I'll give you both cautions and I'll explain them together, is shared vocabulary. Because you've talked to lots of people. And so if somebody comes in, and you know this probably, I shouldn't even have to say it, but if somebody comes in and said, oh yeah, boy, did we have a fight. Now, I grew up in a home. My dad was a pastor. My mom was about the sweetest lady in the world. If my dad raised his voice, I would have perceived that as a fight. Right? Oh, Dad's got his voice raised and looks like he's got a scowl on his face and his jaw set. They must be in a fight. Right? But I have counselees come in that when they say, well, we had a fight last night, they're talking about there was something in the air. Right? It was a glass or a knife. Right? Something was thrown. Something was broken. Something was dented. So if someone comes in and just says, yeah, we had a fight, I know nothing unless I ask more questions. Because my fight and their fight might be very different. In fact, there's no doubt it's probably going to be very different. My wife's never thrown anything at me. Not that she hasn't wanted to, probably. Mm-hmm. But there are folks I talk with, just like you, that right, they've had to run for their own safety. So when they say fight, they may be thinking somebody was getting ready to hit me in the face. Well, that's not happened to me many times. So I don't think of that when I say fight or when I hear someone say fight. And you can use almost any word. We were hungry. You know, if I'm hungry, right, last night when you saw that dessert, you might say, oh, that looks good, I'm hungry. Well, we ate 2.5 hours ago, and we had a wonderful meal. There was shrimp, all kinds of stuff last night. And you're thinking, oh, that looks good, I'm hungry. Right? That's not really hungry. But in my life, it's kind of hungry because that's about as hungry as I get. I remember going home and crying because Mom didn't get the fried chicken made on Sunday mornings early enough because I was hungry. Well, all that had happened is I'd just been hungry since breakfast, and now it's 12:30. But when some folks come in and say they're hungry, right, as you know, they've not eaten maybe in days. So you're going to have to make sure you're actually hearing what they're saying. You're going to have to ask questions that make sure you understand the situation. So clarifying questions. I think of in terms of you ask a question and they say, yes, we had a fight last night. Let's use that as our example. I'll say, so when you say fight, what do you mean? That would be a clarifying question. Why? So that way I'm not thinking my fight, I'm thinking their fight. So, okay, now I think I understand what you mean, but explain it to me, right? If you had a rolling video of what took place, give me that video, right? Tell me what, and then now you're asking for the narrative, and they're telling you their narrative. So you want to make sure that you have clarifying questions because shared experience or shared vocabulary can produce someone you're talking to that doesn't exist. Because what you think happened and what they're actually talking about, those are two different things. Right? So you want to make sure you clarify. So what's going on? That's our first question. Let me give you the second one. Well, actually, the second one says, what do you think about's going on? The third one, what do you want? Let's go to letter D. It says, what do you respond? That should say, how do you respond? I didn't catch that until I was looking at it a minute ago. How do you respond to what is going on? Let's talk about that for a minute. Letter D. How do you respond? Now, why am I jumping there? Because the majority of the people who talk to you only have those two categories. What is going on and how did I respond? They don't think about the other two questions, so let's deal with this one first, then we'll come back. So you say, well, what are we listening for when we're listening for responses? I think there's two kinds of responses. There's an inner man response and there's an outer man response. Right? So the inner man response would include stuff like attitude or affections. There's something that you grow more in love with, or that would be a way to talk about affections. And emotions or feelings. The world system suggests to us that emotions and feelings exist outside of your interpretation as a person. Right? It's almost like they're independent. And so, just anger came over me. Right? Or whatever. So that's not a biblical way of viewing emotions and feelings. When you have an emotion or a feeling, that is a response to what? It's a response to your situation. And so you want to see that as an inner man response. So if they say, why I'm so saddened, response. It might be an appropriate response to what they perceive, right? So I'm not saying that emotions are bad. Don't hear that at all. The point is, there's an emotional response. That's your inner man. What's the outer man? If they say something, that would be outer man. What the words they say. Or what they do. The actions that they have. Those would be outer man responses. So every time someone's in a situation, they're going to respond some way. And they're going to respond internally with attitude, affections, or emotions and feelings. And they're going to respond externally with words and actions. Now again, most of the time what you're going to hear when someone's telling their own story is, this is what she did and this is how I responded, right? It's as if there's a direct line, right? If you were to say, well, why did you respond that way? Well, because that's what she did, right? It's as if because someone did this, then this is the only response I could have had. It's the only reasonable thing anybody would do. And what are they missing? They're missing letter B and letter C. So even in the questions you ask, you're going to be helping them with discernment. You say, well, what's letter B? Well, letter B says, what do you think about what is going on? Letter C says, what do you want in the midst of what's going on? Both of those questions are questions of interpretation. Right? Because they're in a circumstance, but what? They are interpreting it. But that's the hidden, right? That's the hidden secret. You know that they don't. You know they're interpreting, but most of the time the people we talk to don't know they're interpreting. They've never considered they're interpreting. Right? They don't think in their mind, you know what, there's thoughts I'm having and there are things I want in the midst of this situation that are impacting my response. They only think of, that happened, so of course, this is what I did. I mean, you would hit somebody too if they did that. Maybe not, right? There's a lot of other stuff between point 1 and point 2, or between A and B. So let's talk for a minute then about what you think about what is going on. That question, basically, you're saying, how do they make sense of their situation? When you say, what do they think about what's going on? How do they make sense of what's going on? People are interpreters, and they respond to their interpretation. Right? So they're always making sense, just like we always make sense of what's going on. You're never going to talk to someone that is responding only to what is going on, that doesn't exist. What are they responding to? They're responding to their interpretation of what is going on. Right? There's always more. They're responding to what they believe is happening in the midst of what's going on. Right? So they're applying an interpretive grid to it. Let me explain with this kind of a silly illustration. There was a guy that I knew, that I still know, but this was years ago. He was a redhead, right? And so he was a typical redhead. He was quick to anger, right there. He could just get under anybody's skin, right? It's just part of who he was. He owned an electrician business. And so he would volunteer for the church, and it seemed like he was always into it with the pastors. He was a good church member. He would volunteer, but he'd end up spending more money than they wanted or whatever, and it just seemed like there was always turmoil. So over the years, right, we're talking interpretation, he had begun to interpret, this pastor just doesn't like me. Right? I can't do anything to please this pastor. And so he gets engaged finally. He's late bloomer. So he's probably in his 30s. He gets engaged. He goes down to the pastor and says to the pastor, hey, look what happened. We got engaged. His wife's there, and she shows the ring. I guess it should be this hand. She shows the ring. We got engaged. And the pastor told me, right, I'm getting it all second, third hand. The pastor says that he was saying a joke, and he said, well, he looked at her and he said, well, if he ever does anything to hurt you, I love you. He's going to have to come through me. Well, this guy hears that. When they come to premarital, I was doing their premarital counseling. This guy he can't hardly hold it together to even tell me the story. He's so angry. And I'm like, well, what's going on? What makes this angry? He tells me the story. And when he tells it, what does he say? He applies meaning. The pastor doesn't like me. I never can do anything to please him. And he's essentially telling my wife, you're stupid to marry this guy. Or telling my fiance, you're stupid to marry this guy. And so he's livid. Well, what is that? I assume that the pastor was making a joke, because that's what the pastor told me. Because I said to him, listen, it's not going to be helpful to do counseling right now. You're too angry, but this is what we're going to do. Y'all get in your car and you go over to the church, and I want you to talk to your pastor. And these are the questions I want you to ask him, and I want you to unwind this thing. So I sent them, but I immediately called the pastor. He said, I assume you're walking in the Spirit today, but I'm not going to risk it. I am sending your congregant over to talk to you, and this is the problem. And if you were telling a joke, which is what my assumption is, right? In his world, there was no joke. It was impossible. In my world, I'm thinking, I've done stupid stuff like that before, probably telling a joke or saying something. He was trying to emphasize to this girl, as her pastor, how much he loved her. But that's not the guy to emphasize it with. So I said, if there's something you did that might be unwise in your response, you just need to be ready to accept it. Say, would you please forgive me? I miscommunicated. Right? I tried to help on both sides of it. Right? It's because they needed to get it fixed. The pastor said, yeah, I did not mean anything by it. Okay, I don't know if he did or didn't. Doesn't matter, really. Point is, this guy applied meaning. So that when he was responding, he wasn't responding to just the pastor said, hey, if you ever do anything, you have to come to me. He's responding to what he heard is, you're stupid to marry this guy. Because he applied meaning. That happens all the time. When you're if a policeman pulls you over, you have an attitude about the policeman. Right? And when they pull you over, you already have an idea. You're my friend, you're not my friend, you're against me, you don't like beat up trucks that I drive, right? There's something in your mind already. What did my kids do this time? I live in a small town, so my kids sometimes get pulled over and they say, well, we know your dad. Right? Oh, sorry, kids. But point is, you're getting pulled over and you can have an attitude. Why? Because you've applied meaning. It's the way we do in everything. So, what's your sense? How do you interpret it? What meaning are they applying to this event? Another question you could ask is, what conclusions are they drawing? That's part of their thoughts. What story are they telling themselves? Well, she said that because of this. She's never liked you. She always is jealous, right? Sometimes we think, well, they're jealous of us. So then whatever somebody does, you think, well, that's because she's jealous of me. That's why she's doing it. It's all those interpretation issues that they're applying. What beliefs? Here's another great question about thinking. What beliefs about God, others, or themselves are they thinking through? Right? They may have a belief about God, and you say, well, they're doing all that in the moment? Yes. Right? They're in a situation, and what? They're trying to make sense of it. Right. They don't know they're making sense of it, but they're trying to make sense of it. And the way we make sense of things is we think about them. And when we think about them, these are the kinds of questions we're asking ourselves or things we're saying to ourselves that may or may not be true. They may not be accurate. They may not even be close to accurate. But it's what's happening inside of us. And so when you hear their situation, you're going to ask questions then that try to draw out their interpretation. Right? The Bible says, right, deep are the issues of the heart, and a wise person is the one that draws them out. This is part of that drawing out, right? We're going to have to go fishing here. We're going to have to ask good questions. So we're listening for their interpretation. Like when they say, well, this proves that no one cares. It probably doesn't prove that. But in their mind it proves that. Why? Because that's how all these things fit together. Everything is over. No, you just had just one person said no to a job. Well, you've got 10 more applications out there and all this stuff, but now everything's over. And you know this. You hear people say stuff like this. You probably have people in your mind right now. God has abandoned me. Right? So they're applying interpretation. Maybe it's functional interpretation. So as they describe it, they're saying stuff like, well, God is punishing me. Or God doesn't see me. Those are thoughts that you're hearing. They're interpretations. They're in a situation, and now they're applying their thoughts, and they're speaking. That's a response. But what they're saying, you are getting to hear what's going on under the ground in the root system. Right? So God doesn't see me. Nothing will ever change. Right? I'm stuck. No one can be trusted. All of those are functional worldviews. That is the thinking behind the circumstance. Maybe they would say perceived threats. Right? What feels most dangerous to them? Is it losing their children? I'll never see my children again. Last night, what a powerful testimony. I'd never heard his story before. I remembered in the news, but I'd never heard his testimony and hadn't seen the videos or read the book. But when you heard him, actually, that was a fascinating case study that we could work through this. What did he say was bothering the most? Not being in the room with Muslims every day. Not just being in a cell with 8 or 12 other people. What was bothering him every day was the thought, I'll never see my children again. I won't ever be with my wife again. That was functionally what was ruling him. So much so, and he didn't go into the details, but he was saying, I was coming undone. Response. Circumstances, you've been jailed. It's unjust, right? All those things. But then you apply thinking to it, and he told us his thinking. I kept thinking, I'll never see them again. Now, he didn't get into the desires as much, but then he tells us, so what was happening, and I was just spiritually, emotionally, and in every way just coming apart. So what is the perceived threat? When you're talking about thinking, you can also listen for conclusions. Stuff like, well, this always happens to me. That's just never an honest statement. Things don't always happen. There's always, right? They might happen a lot. And you might get yourself into some tough situations and you may need to change friends, but it doesn't always happen. I ruin everything. I was with a lady, I was with this particular individual, and they were fixing a meal, and this lady, I don't know if she was burning it or what she was doing, but she said, I ruin everything. And I'm sitting there listening, chuckling, letting her husband handle it, but chuckling. Because I realize I've eaten her food many times, and it's delicious food. So I ruin everything, right? What is that? That's a response from an interpretation, but it's not accurate. Right? Because I eat her food all the time. It's delicious food. So she doesn't ruin everything that day, maybe. Or somebody says, well, no one